just switch off my camera and then I will read the questions. Um, so let me start from the first question, and here we go. So this is very essential topic, and it's on November 5. All eyes will be on the U.S. elections and Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. Each candidate is preparing themselves for the day, drafting speeches and making programs. So, however, some experts already anticipate possible manipulations of the result. Uh, do you think there might be fraud during the coming elections? And if so, what type and which party is most interested in doing so?
I'm sorry, that there might be what?
Frauds, like.
Oh, fraud. Yeah. Okay. Um, you have to start with American elections if you're going to look at fraud by defining it. If you're talking about fraud uh, in holding out an idea that this is a democratic process and that somehow the desires of the public on various public policy matters, important public policy matters, will be decided, then it's fraudulent, from the inception. The race itself is more akin to a soccer match or a beauty contest, or beauty being a rather inappropriate word, perhaps. Um, and the sort of the audience response to a barrage of advertising and messaging and marketing and basically brainwashing propaganda over the past year and years, really. The two candidates that are being discussed in the public media, there are others, by the way. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are not the only people running for president. Jill Stein is running for president, and Oliver, also for the Libertarian Party, is running for president. Various states will have other candidates on the ballots with the 50 states. The process for getting on the ballot in all 50 states and being on the ballot in all 50 states is a requirement if you're going to be elected because of the nature of the election. You have 50 different processes, each of the 50 states, and then the various other entities like Washington, D.C., the district, and some of the territories, as they're called, like Puerto Rico and others, have their own individual mechanism for getting on the ballot. And in each case, there's the individualized methods, preferred methods of fraud and manipulation. The process is highly political. It's in the hands in each state of the Democratic and Republican Party machinery. The boards of elections are staffed by people chosen by the Democratic and Republican parties. And so when you start, you're talking about a fraudulent enterprise. In the context of it being discussed, whether the Democrats are accusing Republicans of fraud in attempting to stop people from voting because they want, uh, ID that's verifiable for people to vote, or the Republicans saying that the Democrats are having people that are ineligible to vote voting, like people who are not documented and not citizens, or um, in some cases, people who rise from the cemetery, make their way to the polls, and then go back to sleep until the next election. And also, in this particular election, as in the 2020 election, a relatively new phenomenon where the former ability or process for people who were bedridden or otherwise unable to make it to the polls would be able to vote from home or a nursing home facility or some other thing called remote or absentee ballots, or if they were traveling, outside the country, was greatly expanded and added millions of votes in the 2020 election. These ballots had no real chain of custody in most cases. They were mailed to people's homes and then dropped in boxes that were in various locations out in the world, like on the corner of a street and such. And consequently, their integrity was challenged. And as it turned out, in Pennsylvania and Georgia, among other places, a mass of these ballots came in at the end of the counting period, in each case where Trump was winning, swinging the election to Biden. That condition prevails again. Those ballots will be another part, a part of the election again. And so that is one of the primary concerns about fraud. And people, we're going to see how that plays out. Among the population, half the people, basically Republicans, believe that the last election was stolen, and they have very little faith in the integrity of the elections. Half the people, Democrats, believe that the 2016 election was stolen, and they also have very little confidence in the integrity of the elections. So the soil in which all of this takes place is one in which a majority, certainly, of the population does not trust the integrity of the process. And so whatever accusations are hurled after the election, valid or not, it takes place within an environment where real fraud is quite possible by design, and B, where the people don't believe the outcome if it's not one that they like.
Yeah, thank you for so detailed answer. And we got 5 questions. So could I please ask you to, yeah, speak a little shorter, just by the case. It's very interesting to discuss, but I don't think all that you're saying will be in the final material.
I understand this. Yeah, I know. I've done with Maria Solopova the 28-minute interview, and they use 90 seconds. I do television myself, so I understand.
Yeah, it's just about the format and just business, So why do some U.S. states allow citizens to vote without ID, as you already mentioned, and how does this affect the outcome? And why are Democrats in favor of such voting? What advantage do they gain from it, maybe?
There is a belief that's backed with some historical data that the larger the turnout in a presidential election, the better the Democratic Party does, and the lower the turnout, the better the Republican Party does. In many states, the Democratic enrollment, that is, people who are registered to vote as a Democrat, is greater than the Republican enrollment. Consequently, the bigger turnout, if you have 100% turnout, the Democrat wins. That drives the technical wrangling that takes place. And so Republicans are concerned about fraud with basically fraudulent turnout, that people who are not eligible to vote, or sometimes people that don't exist, I'll go in using somebody else's identity, for example, a dead person's identity. This is not so uncommon, by the way. We'll go in and vote, and the Democrats will have an advantage that way. The Democrats think that any attempt to tamp down the incidence of fraud by requiring people to have legal identification or any other extra step that has to be taken is an attempt by Republicans to chill or to tamp down turnout. Consequently, they're saying, look, what you're trying to do is stop people from voting who should be eligible to vote because you think the fewer people that vote, the better your candidates will do. So that's the dispute between the two of them. Well, I note that most people in the world are required to produce, some sort of proof of who they are when they go to vote for the obvious reasons. But that is not the case here. And the reason it is in some states and not others is that the elections are conducted not by the federal government, but by the individual states.
Okay. The question number 3 is about that some of 2020 exit polls show that 65 of migrants voted for Biden, while 32 voted for Trump. And there's some talks that more migrants coming to election race to maybe vote more, and it's allow Democrats to come more voters to their turn. So how likely is that to happen again now?
It's difficult to say how likely it is that more, I assume by migrants, you're talking about undocumented migrants. Documented migrants, those that have citizenship have the right to vote. And so we don't consider those in the conversation. As it turns out, among that group, Trump does very well, and Republicans generally do. They seem to be concerned about illegal immigration as much as, in some cases, more than the balance of the citizenry in the country. As for illegal migrants or undocumented migrants, the law is clear that they're not permitted to vote. The manipulations of the law by providing certain documentation that can then be used to vote. In other words, driver's licenses, for example, where before they were not available to people that were undocumented, are now in some states available to people who are undocumented. It may say on the license, it may note that they're undocumented, but when you present this at a polling place or at the Board of Elections, this tiny little dot somewhere on the license is or isn't noticed. In any event, different subsets of documentation are being given to people that Republicans say can be manipulated into allowing them to vote. They say they have evidence of this. The Democrats say that that's nonsense. Certainly, you can see every effort being given by Democrats, however, to, without publicly declaring it because it's highly unpopular, to enable pretty much any immigrant, regardless of status, to vote. And that is a point of contention between the two.
Okay, and can you recall any high-profile scandals involving fraud, tampering, or manipulation during voting?
Going back to the beginning of the so-called republic, there's Boss Tweed and Teapot Dome and all these different scandals where, in the process of investigating criminal activity by government officials, they've discovered that some of the best and most reliable voters in Brooklyn were in the cemetery under 6 feet of dirt. That kind of fraud was, and still is, it happens. The the 2000 presidential election was a highly contested one, and that was based upon what many said was a fraudulent use of the voting machines there and a fraudulent interpretation of the results. They were using punch card technology then. The machines, apparently many had an alignment problem that seemed to be concentrated in some Democratic districts. This was an election conducted by the state of Florida. The governor of Florida at that time was Jeb Bush, whose brother was the Republican candidate for president. There were a number of manipulations that handed Florida and thus the election to Bush that almost were defining examples in the public mind of voter fraud. In 2004, in Ohio, there were allegations, and I actually helped gather some considerable evidence that the FBI refused to look at for weeks, that the state was manipulating the placement of voting machines to make it difficult for Democratic districts to vote, where you had long lines in the rain because the machines were either not opened yet or hadn't been delivered or whatever, and Republican machines had been, facilitating a vote there. This is the kind of fraud, in other words, by its institutional, means, where the Secretary of State conducts the election on behalf of the state, and they manipulate the outcome by manipulating the availability of machines to voters. I've seen personally a variety of different types of behavior that in most places would be considered fraud, although here they're almost part of the daily practice. We could use the example of Robert Kennedy in this campaign as one example. He declares his intent to run. He's obviously a viable candidate. He's a Kennedy, for God's sake, and has the money to run behind him. And he has to go through the process of getting certified for the ballot in all 50 states. And in each case, the Democrats put up a huge effort and spend millions of dollars to impede his ability to get on the ballot. And then he's thrown off by officials who are also members of the Democratic Party. And this resulted in what we've seen, where he withdrew from the race and is now a supporter of the Trump campaign. There are much cruder examples of this that you can look at the municipal level. I've experienced some of it myself, including where voting machines have been taken out in the middle of the day and new ones installed in districts where the person who was running as an insurgent might do well. And that machine, for some reason, never shows up again. And the new machine has, of course, half the count that it would have had if they weren't swapped out. And therefore, that candidate who was winning there suddenly doesn't win by enough for them to matter in the overall election. So there's a variety of ways to do this. One interesting thing is that a former member of the Senate Judiciary or the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, said about 10 years ago now, when they were talking about getting a new set of machines to have installed around the country, when they were talking about the machines like you have in Russia, where you write on the paper ballot and then it gets scanned and read into the system and deposited into the tank under the scanner. That involving paper ballots does not help. He said, I've seen all kinds of fraud with paper ballots. They invite fraud. That's what he said. And then they adopted these ballots, and they have found many ways to do fraud with paper ballots. As I mentioned, particularly these mail-in ballots that have no chain of custody.
Yeah, you just mentioned the mail fraud. Yeah, and this is the case that I found in the internet. That Craig Calloway was arrested in 2022 on charges of mail-in ballot fraud for the 2020 election. He reportedly paid citizens of Atlantic City to receive ballots from the people they didn't know. And some polls suggest that today U.S. voters are concerned about the transparency and honesty of the mail voting process. So because some of citizens don't have cars, so they can drive away and so on. So was the introduction of mail voting a blow to the US election system, and why? Is the first one question here. And the second, do you anticipate this to be an issue again? Do you think this card will be played on November 5th?
First, the introduction of these, this expansion, in essence, of the remote paper ballots. Expansion doesn't do it justice. When you had, say, a unit of 10, you had a unit of 1,000. The expansion of this actually was sought in the period early 2019, prior to COVID, and it was rejected in Pennsylvania, for example, where there was a Republican legislature, Democratic governor, and they had Democratic Secretary of State also. The governor proposed, or Democrats in the legislature proposed, expanding this for the 2020 election. And Pennsylvania is a key state in the presidential campaign. And it was voted down in the state legislature, saying that this invites fraud. And so then they resubmitted it after COVID, saying, look, this is an emergency. People are going to be spreading COVID if they go to the polling places. For God's sake, let them vote at home. The legislature still voted it down. And so the governor issued an executive order, and the attorney general issued an interpretive ruling, and the Secretary of State issued a regulatory change allowing it. And consequently, in Philadelphia in particular, massive amounts of mail-in ballots were produced and utilized. We don't know by whom. We know who they were supposed to come from, but there's no evidence to prove it one way or the other. And consequently, that swung Philadelphia from Trump to Biden. Trump was winning Philadelphia. And that in turn swung Pennsylvania to Biden, which in turn swung the election. That happened already. The effort to do that again has only expanded by the Democrats. And the Republicans claim to be able to deal with it now that they have some method of monitoring what's happening and et cetera. And we're going to see how it plays out. But it certainly, I would say that if if Harris wins, and these votes are a significant part of her winning in one of these key states, the so-called swing states of Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada, then there will be they'll be hell to pay. Do I think that it's going to happen again? Yeah, they're already haggling over it.
Okay, let me stop the recording here.